Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight as the rain falls softly beyond your window and the world begins to quiet down. Allow yourself this moment to drift, to let your thoughts settle and your eyes grow heavy. Tonight's journey will carry us into the shadowed corners of the 19th century, into locked rooms and long corridors, into the lives and minds of those once labeled bad. We'll explore the forgotten architecture of Victorian asylums, the human stories within their walls, and the shifting science that tried to understand it all. But before we begin, if you enjoy these calming explorations into strange histories and hidden truths, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue telling stories like this one. And feel free to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a quiet bedroom, a rainy drive, or just a place where your mind can gently wander, I'd love to know. Now, imagine yourself walking slowly down a gravel path, wet with evening mist. A tall gate creaks open before you. Behind it, a stone building waits in silence. The windows are narrow. The walls are thick. This is not a place meant to be visited lightly. Let us step inside together and begin. Imagine it is a late autumn afternoon in the English countryside, sometime around the year 1875. The sky is a low, heavy gray. A thin mist clings to the hillsides. The trees are bare now, their limbs motionless, as if bracing against the coming cold. You walk a narrow path, flanked by stone walls, your footsteps softened by the fallen leaves, and ahead, emerging like a shadow from the fog, stands the asylum. It is vast. The structure rises not in defiance, but in quiet dominance over the landscape. Made of red brick, stone, or sometimes pale sandstone, its facade is both grand and grim, ornate in some places, but always austere. A central tower looms over the main entry. On either side, symmetrical wings stretch outward, angled like the arms of a patient reaching for something just beyond their grasp. These wings form what was known as the Kirkbride Plan, a unique and now largely forgotten architectural philosophy developed in the mid-1800s by American physician Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. He believed that light, space, and fresh air were essential elements in treating mental illness. In his view, the building itself was part of the cure. The wings were staggered to allow for sunlight to reach every room. Air was meant to circulate freely through long ventilation shafts. High ceilings created a sense of openness, and wide corridors minimized crowding. Even the placement of windows followed careful rules, designed to avoid casting harsh shadows that might agitate sensitive minds. But while the philosophy was hopeful, the reality was often more complicated. Let yourself step into one of these corridors now. The hallway stretches ahead in dim stillness. Gas lamps flicker quietly on the walls. The floor beneath you is polished but worn, scuffed by years of cautious footsteps. The air is thick with the scent of damp stone, paraffin wax, and the faint medicinal sharpness of carbolic soap. To your left and right are heavy wooden doors, each marked with a small metal plate and a keyhole. At eye level, a square window in each door, just a few inches across, reveals only shadows inside. These are patient rooms, sparse, utilitarian, and built for durability over comfort. A typical room might contain little more than a narrow bed bolted to the floor, a wash basin, and a single chair. Walls were often painted in muted greens or creams, colors thought to have calming effects. Windows were barred, but the bars were shaped with decorative flourishes, intended to soothe rather than intimidate. Silence hangs heavy here. It is not the silence of peace, but of containment. Each hallway had a different purpose. In the early asylum system, patients were divided not by diagnosis as we know it today, but by behavior and perceived severity. Terms like melancholia, mania, and moral insanity were used to determine one's placement. Those deemed dangerous were placed in more restrictive wings, often farthest from the entrance. while the so-called quiet lunatics were allowed closer to the gardens and supervised walks. That idea of moral treatment, where kindness and structure were believed to improve mental health, was a driving force in the early design. Gardens were landscaped. Libraries were stocked with religious texts, poetry, and proper novels. Recreation rooms were added, and chapels stood at the center of many complexes, the steeple rising like a spiritual compass. And yet, for all its outward humanity, the institution was still a place of control. Many of the design elements, however gentle in intention, were still built upon the idea that the mind must be restrained, redirected, or quietly corrected. Iron locks, observation panels, soundproof doors, deep basements for the most disturbed, an operating theater for the physical treatments that followed. Staff moved through the building with quiet efficiency. Nurses in gray uniforms, orderlies with rings of keys, attendants assigned to every ward, their movements dictated by shift bells and charts. To be a patient in such a place meant surrendering autonomy, sometimes forever. Many were admitted involuntarily. A husband might commit a wife for hysteria. A son might place an elderly parent for senile agitation. Once inside, protest was often taken as further proof of illness. And so the walls absorbed it all. The hopes of reformers, the fear of the confined, the quiet resignation of those who no longer resisted. There were gardens, yes, but also padded cells. There were libraries, but also restraint chairs. There was kindness, and there was cold routine. The architecture of the Victorian Asylum speaks without a voice, speaks in the angles of its walls, in the repetition of its windows, in the relentless symmetry of its design. It tells of a time when society did not know how to understand the mind, and instead tried to contain it, to structure it, to wrap it in stone. And even now, though many of these buildings have been abandoned or repurposed, their blueprints linger. Some stand empty, taken over by ivy and wind. Others have become museums or housing developments, or left to rot in remote corners of forgotten towns. But the buildings, remember, if you walk the perimeter of one on a cloudy afternoon, you may still feel it, the quiet weight of order, the echo of footsteps long stopped, the soft, unseen presence of lives once lived behind the walls. And now, with the scent of old paper and brick still clinging faintly to our thoughts, let us move forward, not just deeper into the building, but into the life of someone who stepped through those gates willingly. A young woman, a journalist, and a truth seeker disguised as a patient. Let the fog settle gently around your shoulders as we return to the streets of New York City, noisy, crowded, and restless. As it was in the year 1887, the horses' hooves on cobblestone, conning the clatter of market carts, the shouted conversations of dock workers. Beneath all of this movement, the city held its secrets. One of them was an island in the East River. From the shoreline, Blackwell's Island was little more than a gray smudge, narrow and windswept, a place where the unwanted were quietly sent away. The poor, the sick, the criminal, and the mad. To the city's elite, it was invisible. To most residents, it was unknowable. But one young woman wanted to know. She was born Elizabeth Jane Cochran in western Pennsylvania. By her early 20s, she had taken the pen name Nellie Bly, and with it, a fierce determination to uncover truth by living it. She was no ordinary journalist. She did not sit behind a desk or rewrite press releases. She wanted to walk in others' shoes, to witness injustice from the inside. And so, she set her sights on Blackwell's Island. Her plan was simple and dangerous. She would feign madness. She would get herself committed to the women's lunatic asylum, and once inside, she would observe everything. She began at a modest boarding house for working women. She gave a false name, Nellie Brown, and pretended to be confused, afraid, and forgetful. She refused to sleep, stared wide-eyed at other guests, and muttered about unseen threats. When a doctor was summoned, she continued her act. Subtle, consistent, never overplayed. The doctor pronounced her insane. Soon after, she was taken before a judge, where a second physician reinforced the diagnosis. There were no extensive tests, no thorough evaluations, just a few brief questions, a worried glance, and a swift machinery of commitment. She was declared hopelessly demented and sent by ferry to Blackwell's Island. She had succeeded. But as the boat cut across the water and the city fell behind her, Nellie realized just how real the journey had become. The women's lunatic asylum was a long gray complex of stone and iron. Cold air rolled off the river and into the courtyards. Inside, the walls were close and echoing. Her room had bare floors, a single iron bed, and a cracked window that rattled in the wind. She was treated not as a reporter, or even as a human being, but as one of the insane. The daily routine began early. Patients were woken before dawn, ushered into freezing washrooms, and given little time for personal care. Breakfast was often a thin broth with hard, crusted bread. The food was so poorly cooked that Nellie could barely swallow it. Many women, especially the older ones, simply didn't eat. After breakfast came hours of silence. Patients were lined up on wooden benches in long, drafty corridors. No talking, no reading, no activity. They were to sit still, hands in their laps, eyes downcast. Those who fidgeted were reprimanded. Those who spoke out were punished. The baths were perhaps worst of all. Cold water, roughly administered. Nellie described being plunged into icy water and scrubbed with a stiff brush until her skin was raw. She later wrote, quietly but plainly, that the experience was more punishment than hygiene. She began to notice how many of the women around her did not seem mad at all. Some had come from immigrant communities and spoke little English. Others had been homeless, or elderly, or simply too difficult for their families to care for. Some were likely suffering from grief, exhaustion, or loneliness, and yet, once inside, their protests were viewed as symptoms. To disagree was to confirm one's madness. There were moments of quiet kindness. A nurse who tucked in a frail patient, a fellow inmate who offered part of her bread. But more often, Nellie found an atmosphere of numbness. The staff, many of whom were overworked and undertrained, moved through the halls with indifference. It wasn't always cruelty, she observed. Sometimes it was something colder. Apathy. She listened carefully, watched, took mental notes. She remembered the names of the women, their habits, their stories, but she could not write. There were no notebooks, no pens, no escape. For 10 long days, she was submerged in that quiet oppression. And, just as quietly as she had entered, she was removed. The New York World, the newspaper backing her investigation, sent lawyers and reporters to secure her release. It took negotiation. But eventually, the doors opened again. She emerged, pale, tired, and determined. Her articles, published in a serialized format under the title 10 Days in a Madhouse, caused a stir. She did not rant. She did not accuse with anger. Instead, she laid out what she had seen, calmly, precisely, without exaggeration. And that restraint made the impact all the greater. Readers were horrified. City officials were forced to respond. An investigation followed. Reforms were introduced. Budgets increased. Staffing improved. And for the first time, the hidden world of the asylum had been pulled into public view. But the real legacy of Nellie Bly's work was not just in policy. It was in perception. She had shown that mental illness and the institutions built to contain it were not distant problems. They were close, tangled in social injustice, gender inequality, poverty, and language, she asked implicitly. How many of us could end up behind those walls, given just a twist of fate? Today, Nellie Bly is remembered as a pioneer of investigative journalism, but within the quiet tone of her reporting, You can still hear the echo of the halls she walked. You can feel the stone floors beneath your feet, smell the wet linen, hear the muffled weeping behind closed doors. She brought it all out into the light, not with a shout, but with a whisper the world could not ignore. And now we leave her behind on the deck of the ferry, city skyline ahead, wind in her hair, notebook in hand. Let us turn inward now to those who stayed behind, who never had a newspaper waiting, never stepped back through the gates. Now, take a moment and imagine yourself waking not in your own bed, but in a narrow cot, the mattress thin and uneven beneath your back. A draft creeps in through a crack in the window, brushing your face with the faint scent of mildew and coal smoke. You open your eyes, but the room is already lit, dimly, with the muted flicker of a gas lamp in the corridor beyond. You are a patient in a Victorian asylum, and today is the same as yesterday, and the day before that. The walls are bare, pale green or cream, chipped and rubbed raw, where the iron-framed bed has scraped against them. There is no clock, no mirror, no photographs or letters, only a chamber pot under the bed, a splintering washstand, and a heavy wooden chair that no one is allowed to move. Personal possessions are forbidden, for fear they may be used to cause harm to others or to oneself. A knock at the door means it's time to rise. No matter the season, the hour is early. A nurse, often stern-faced and brisk, stands at the threshold. You are expected to dress yourself quickly in the same coarse uniform you wear every day, gray or brown wool, ill-fitting, and made to withstand many washings. The buttons are mismatched. The collar itches. Outside, the hallway is cool and smells faintly of iron, old soap, and chalk. The air feels still, heavy. Other patients file out of their rooms in silence, forming a line down the corridor. Some shuffle slowly, their slippers worn thin at the soles. Others whisper to themselves. A few stare directly ahead, eyes vacant but wide open, as if watching something no one else can see. The morning begins with roll call. A nurse reads from a ledger. You are not called by your name, but by your assigned number. It is easier that way. They say easier to manage. After that comes the first meal. The dining room is not large enough for everyone at once, so patients eat in shifts. You are seated on a hard bench at a long wooden table, under the watchful gaze of attendants. Breakfast is simple, porridge or gruel, often cold by the time it is served, a crust of bread, sometimes a small piece of cheese, tea that is more hot water than flavor. The food is bland, sometimes sour, occasionally rotten. You eat because you are expected to, not because you are hungry. Conversations are discouraged. Speaking out of turn may lead to being isolated later in the day. Many patients eat quickly, heads down, barely lifting their eyes. After breakfast, the long day begins. In many wards, patients sit on wooden benches arranged around the walls, backs straight, hands folded, eyes lowered. The room is silent, except for the sounds of distant footsteps, the occasional rattle of keys, or the cough of someone nearby. There is no music. There are no books unless you've been judged fit to handle them. You may be asked to perform tasks: shelling peas, folding linens, sewing uniforms, raking the gravel in the courtyard. Work is considered therapeutic, not for your improvement, but for the institution's order. Idleness, they say, invites chaos. If you are cooperative, you may be granted a short walk in the airing court, a rectangular yard enclosed by tall stone walls. The path is circular. You walk with others, but do not speak. The grass is patchy, the garden overgrown. A wrought iron fence separates the men's court from the women's. There is no view but sky and brick. If you show agitation, if you pace, fidget, or ask questions, you may be labeled excitable. That label follows you on your patient card, and from that moment on, your treatment changes. You may be given a quieting draft, a tincture of opium or chlorohydrate. You may be isolated in a side room, where the walls are thick and no one can hear you if you cry out. You may also be restrained. Restraints are not uncommon. Straps of leather, stiff with use, are buckled around wrists or ankles. Some patients are placed in straitjackets, tight-fitting garments designed to prevent self-harm, though they more often cause bruises and panic. In some cases, the patient is bound to a chair known as the tranquilizer, a wooden structure with wide arms and a head clamp meant to encourage stillness. Some are left there for hours, others for days. Bathing is infrequent and seldom pleasant. The water is cold, drawn from a cistern and poured into a shared tub. Attendants scrub patients quickly and without kindness. The soap is harsh, the towels rough. Privacy does not exist here. Some women weep quietly during these washings. Others stare through it. When ailments arise, fever, cough, wounds, care is minimal. A spoonful of castor oil, a mustard plaster, quinine, if it is available. Most wards are crowded, and disease spreads easily. Some patients grow thinner by the week, their bodies failing slowly beneath their woolen uniforms. And yet, amid the repetition and restriction, life does not stop. Some find small comforts. A folded scrap of paper tucked in a shoe, a lullaby hummed under breath, the warmth of another patient's hand held briefly when the nurses aren't watching. These moments are rare, but they are something. The evening arrives with more silence. Supper is served, often broth or boiled potatoes, occasionally meat, though it is tough and served in small amounts. Afterward, patients are marched back to their rooms. Lights are lowered, doors are locked, and you are alone again. The mattress is no softer than before, the blanket no warmer, but sleep eventually comes, brought on by fatigue or medicine, or the body's quiet surrender to the sameness of another day. This was not the experience of one patient, or even a few. It was the routine reality for tens of thousands. In England, in America, in France, in Scotland, asylums stretched from rural countryside to city outskirts, each one echoing the same rhythms. Many of those confined were not violent, nor dangerous. Some suffered from grief, others from postpartum depression. Still others were elderly or epileptic, or simply poor. A few were just unwanted, inconvenient daughters, unmarried mothers, outspoken wives. Once inside, a person could remain for years, or decades, or the rest of their life. And the system, as it was, rarely looked back. The world outside changed. Streetcars arrived. Race began and ended. Radios spoke of progress. But inside the asylum, time was still a loop, a holding pattern of human lives, tucked behind gates in stone, made quiet by design. But their stories did not vanish entirely. Many were preserved in patient records, medical notes, and abandoned ledges, now held in dusty archives. Some appear in brief memoirs by visiting physicians. Others survive only in the stories passed down of the woman who sang to herself in the yard, or the man who drew clocks on the wall, each stuck at the same hour. So, tonight, as we gently step away from the iron beds and the gravel courtyards, let us take one last breath of that world, not to dwell in it, but to understand it. Let us now drift toward the ideas that shape it all, the beliefs, the theories, the changing science that defined what it meant to be mad, and how, for better or worse, they tried to treat it. Now, let us step further, not through halls of brick and iron, but into the minds of those who built them, into the philosophies, treatments, and shifting understandings of the human psyche as it was once known. Imagine yourself in a quiet study, the year perhaps 1842. A fire crackles in the grate. A physician sits at his desk by candlelight, leafing through a leather-bound volume on moral treatment. He scribbles a note in the margins. Melancholia may benefit from seclusion and structured walking. Outside, a storm rolls in. This man is not cruel, nor is he especially enlightened. He, like many of his time, is groping through the dark, trying to make sense of something intangible, the mind when it unravels. Okay? In the early 19th century, mental illness was often seen as a moral failing, a weakness of will or character. Terms like melancholia, mania, and hysteria were commonly used, but their meanings were fluid. Diagnosis relied more on observation and social norms than medical evidence. A woman who cried excessively after childbirth might be labeled hysterical. A man who heard voices might be declared mad. A child who refused to speak might be marked as feeble-minded. And so, asylums were built, not just to treat, but to remove. To relocate the unexplainable to somewhere quieter, somewhere apart. But within those walls, science stirred. One early approach, known as moral treatment, emerged in the late 18th century and gained ground in the decades that followed. It emphasized compassion, routine, and structure. Okay. Patients were to be treated with dignity, given fresh air, clean clothing, and orderly environments. Okay. It was a reaction against earlier methods, chains, beatings, and filthy cells. In some places, moral treatment truly was more humane. Asylums under this model resembled self-contained villages with workshops, gardens, chapels, and even small theaters. The idea was to restore the mind through calm, repetition, and meaningful labor. But over time, even moral treatment gave way to overcrowding. As populations grew, institutions struggled to maintain their ideals. One doctor might have overseen 20 patients in 1820, but by 1880, it might be 200. Faced with rising numbers and diminishing resources, physicians turned to new tools. Some were hopeful, others were crude, and some were simply misguided. Hydrotherapy was one of the most common. Patients were wrapped in cold, damp sheets to reduce agitation. Some were placed in lukewarm baths for hours, even days. The water changed regularly by attendants. The theory was that water could cleanse not just the body, but the mind. Phrenology, the study of skull shapes and bumps, claimed to reveal mental faculties and personality traits. Though widely accepted in its time, it would later be dismissed as pseudoscience. Still, it lingered long enough to influence asylum classification systems. Trepanation, the act of drilling holes in the skull, was largely a relic of older times, but echoes of it remained. In more advanced hospitals, surgical interventions were beginning to reappear under new names, often without the patient's consent. By the late 19th century, the asylum was also becoming a laboratory. New diagnoses emerged: dementia precox, now known as schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, paranoia. The classifications multiplied, though understanding remained elusive. Doctors recorded behavior meticulously, but had little consensus on cause. Some believed madness stemmed from heredity, a stain passed down through generations. This view, popular in both medical and political circles, fed into darker policies. Patients were sometimes sterilized. Families were told not to have more children. In the early 20th century, the idea of mental hygiene would even fuel eugenics movements. Other theories pointed to brain inflammation or degeneration of the nervous system, but the mind refused to reveal itself through flesh. By the turn of the 20th century, chemical interventions began to surface. Sedatives like bromides and chlorohydrate were administered widely, often daily. The goal was not to cure, but to calm, to make patients easier to manage. Electricity, too, entered the asylum. At first, it was used experimentally, mild shots, applied to the scalp, thought to stimulate mental clarity. Later, more aggressive methods emerged, but in the Victorian era, electricity remained more curiosity than cure. What was missing, again and again, was an understanding of the person. Treatment focused on the visible, behavior, posture, compliance. If a patient was quiet, they were considered improved. If agitated, they were restrained. Few asked what the patient felt, remembered, or needed. There were exceptions. Some physicians, particularly women entering the field late in the 19th century, began to advocate for more patient-centered care. They observed that trauma, abuse, and isolation often preceded breakdowns. They questioned whether madness was always madness, or sometimes just sorrow unspoken. These ideas would take root more deeply in the century to come, but in the Victorian Asylum, progress was slow and uneven. Yet even within these old halls, through the theories that failed and the treatments that soothed or harmed, science inched forward. And perhaps, more importantly, stories accumulated. Doctors filled notebooks, patients scribbled thoughts on scraps of paper, observers recorded patterns. And over time, a map began to form, not of the brain, but of experience. A woman mourning her lost child, man trapped by voices only he could hear, a boy who never learned to speak, but rocked gently in his chair, watching the light shift on the wall. They were studied, misunderstood, often mislabeled, but they were seen. And now, as we step gently away from these theories, some noble, some tragic, we return to ourselves, to the present, to the safety of quiet rooms and warm blankets. The asylum walls may have crumbled, the ledgers closed, but the echoes remain. Let us now close this journey gently with one final reflection. And now we come to the end of our quiet journey. You've walked the corridors of a forgotten institution. You've heard the hush of stone walls and the soft rhythm of daily rituals. You've followed the footsteps of those who once lived behind locked doors, not as villains or monsters, but as people caught in a system built on fear, confusion, and a desire to heal, even when the tools were blunt or broken. We explored the strange beauty of the buildings themselves, designed to impose calm, yet often holding back chaos. We followed Nellie Bly into a world most never saw, as she risked everything to bring the truth to light. We sat quietly through the days of repetition and silence that defined so many lives, and we listened to the shifting voices of science, always searching for answers in the dark. The Victorian Asylum is long gone now, its gates rusted, its halls emptied, but the questions it raised still echo. What does it mean to be well? Who decides? And how can we treat the mind without forgetting the soul? Tonight, as you lie still and let the rain continue to fall softly in the background, let your breath slow. Let the names and faces you've met tonight drift gently away like pages in a closing book. Let the silence feel softer now, not the silence of confinement, but the silence of rest. You are here. You are safe. The past cannot follow. And if your eyes are still open, feel free to let them close. Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. Whether you're curled beneath a heavy blanket, listening to rain on the roof, or simply settling in for a quiet moment before sleep, this time is just for you. For stillness, for curiosity without urgency, for wandering thoughts and softened edges. Tonight, we'll open the lid gently on a story wrapped in wood, rumor, and spiritual folklore. It's the story of a box. Not just any box, but the Dybbuk Box, a wine cabinet steeped in legend, often said to hold a restless spirit from Jewish folklore. But this isn't just a ghost story. It's a journey through history, belief, fear, and the blurry line between tradition and invention. We'll begin with the mysterious rise of the Dybbuk Box itself, where it came from, what was said to live inside, and how the legend grew. Then we'll explore the man who made it famous, Kevin Mannis, and the curious path the box took from a quiet estate sale to internet lore. Next, we'll step softly into the lived experiences of communities historically burdened by accusations of curses and possession, where belief and stigma intertwined. And finally, we'll examine the deeper folklore, the Dybbuk, as it appears in Jewish mystical tradition, what it meant, what it didn't, and how pop culture may have twisted something sacred into something simply scary. But before we begin, if you enjoyed this kind of thoughtful, calming storytelling, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And leave a comment, just a simple note to let me know where you're listening from tonight. Whether you're drifting off in a small apartment, driving through the rain, or just pausing after a long day, I'm glad you're here. Now, take a slow breath, let the world fall quiet, and come with me into the dim corners of antique shops, folklore archives, and memories whispered in candlelight. Our story begins not in a horror movie, but in a storage room filled with boxes and forgotten things. Picture yourself in a quiet corner of an antique shop. The air is heavy with dust and cedar oil. The floorboards creak beneath your feet, muffled by layers of old rugs that no longer lie flat. In the back, shelves lean under the weight of forgotten clocks, tarnished silver, and carefully labeled boxes filled with mismatched keys. There is no music playing, only the faint ticking of an unseen watch and the occasional sigh of the building settling into itself. You wander slowly, letting your fingers trace the edges of things that haven't been touched in years. Objects once loved, now simply waiting. And then, tucked behind a row of mismatched china plates and an old Torah scroll missing its case, you see it, a wooden wine cabinet, small, unremarkable at first glance, maybe 9 or 10 inches high. The wood is dark, with subtle floral carvings along the corners. Its doors are closed, though one hinge appears just slightly uneven. The surface is scratched and worn. A faded label clings to the bottom, written in a language you don't immediately recognize. It is this object, this humble box, that will come to be known as the Dybbuk Box. To understand why, we have to take a step back, not just to the early 2000s, when the story first gained popularity, but much further back, to the roots of Jewish spiritual folklore, where the idea of a Dybbuk first took form. In Jewish mystical tradition, especially within branches of Kabbalah, the Dybbuk was not originally a villain. It was a soul, specifically a dislocated one, a spirit that had not found rest after death, perhaps because of a grave sin, or perhaps because something had been left undone, clung, as the name suggests, from the Hebrew Dybbuk, to cling to the world of the living. These spirits were said to attach themselves not to objects, but to people, most often not with cruelty, but with desperation. The person possessed by a Dybbuk might speak in voices that were not their own, might know things they had no way of learning, might behave erratically, retreat into themselves, or exhibit signs of deep sorrow or confusion. A rabbi, trained in mystical texts, might be called to perform an exorcism, not with holy water or fire, but with prayer and intention. The goal was not to punish the spirit, but to release it, to help it find peace. The ritual was complex. Psalms were recited, the name of God was invoked, and often the community would gather, not to gawk, but to bear witness. The removal of a Dybbuk was not a spectacle, it was a release, a funeral in its own way, for a soul that never made it home. Nowhere in these older stories was there mention of wooden boxes. There were amulets, talismans, scrolls, but never a cabinet sealed with nails or glue to imprison a ghost. The idea of binding a Dybbuk into a container is a modern construction, an imaginative evolution shaped by other traditions and adapted, perhaps, to fit the needs of a good story. The legend of the Dybbuk Box, as we know it, began circulating widely in the early 2000s. Stories began to appear on internet forums and paranormal message boards. Some posts spoke of strange dreams, of shadowy figures at the foot of the bed, of lights flickering and mirrors cracking without warning. At the center of these accounts was always the same object, a small, intricately carved wine box. It wasn't long before the term Dybbuk Box became synonymous with supernatural danger. It began appearing on auction sites, always accompanied by stories, always with warnings. Do not open. For display only. Owner assumes all risk. These listings weren't just sales. They were invitations to participate in a modern myth. The details shifted from retelling to retelling. Some claimed the box had been used in a seance. Others said it had been buried with a Holocaust survivor. One version described the contents in vivid detail: dried rose petals, a candlestick, two small locks of hair, a goblet, and a stone with strange writing etched into it. Another claimed the box emitted the scent of jasmine, or sometimes cat urine. And yet, for all its variations, the core idea remained the same. The Dybbuk Box was cursed. But what is a curse, really? In Jewish tradition, curses are not tossed out lightly. The idea of binding malevolent power into an object echoes more closely with older folk traditions. It's protective magic found in Eastern Europe, in which spirits or energies were invoked, directed, or repelled using specific rituals. Protective mezuzahs, inscribed amulets, even bottles sealed with salt or herbs. It's all meant to create balance between seen and unseen worlds. The Dybbuk Box legend borrows elements from these traditions, but assembles them through the lens of modern folklore. In fact, the concept of a haunted object gaining power through storytelling is deeply contemporary. It's not just what the box is, it's what people believe about it. The more it's feared, the more it's shared, the more real it becomes. And that is where the Dybbuk Box finds its potency. It's in collective imagination. It lives in the places between cultural memory, inherited trauma, and pop horror myth. It blends sacred language with cinematic suspense. It mixes real grief, Jewish and diasporic, generational and quiet, with internet-age curiosity. It is not an artifact of the past. It is a creation of the present, built not in workshops or synagogues, but in late-night online postings, YouTube videos, and whispered warnings at paranormal conventions. Yet, there is something haunting about it, something that invites pause, because whether or not one believes the stories, the Dybbuk Box taps into a deeper current. A longing to name what disturbs us and to contain it, to trap grief in a box, to assign fear to a hinge and latch, to believe that something awful can be hidden away, labeled, and left untouched, so long as we do not open it. But someone did open it, and someone wrote down what happened next. To understand the Dybbuk Box fully, we must meet the man who brought it into the public eye, the storyteller, the seller, the witness. Imagine yourself walking into a small, privately owned antique shop tucked away on a quiet street in Portland, Oregon. The shelves are filled with aged books, cracked porcelain, and faded postcards. Behind the counter stands a man, Kevin Manus, a storyteller by nature, a man who, by his own admission, appreciates the art of the tale as much as the object itself. It was in the late 1990s, sometime around the turn of the millennium, that Manus came across the box. He had visited an estate sale in the city, something he often did in search of intriguing, forgotten things. The estate had belonged to a woman who had survived the Holocaust. Kerr family described her as private, deeply spiritual, and protective of her belongings. Among the many items for sale was a small wooden wine cabinet, which caught Manus's attention, not for any supernatural reason, but because it looked, as he would later describe, interesting, old, handmade, just mysterious enough to spark curiosity. He purchased the box and brought it back to his shop. It was there, according to Manus, that the story began to twist. He claimed that shortly after acquiring the cabinet, strange things began to happen. Light bulbs in his shop shattered inexplicably. Doors slammed without warning. He reported sudden smells, jasmine, and, at other times, the acrid scent of ammonia or cat urine. Most unsettling of all, he began having vivid nightmares, always the same dream, of a dark figure standing beside him, watching silently as he lay paralyzed in bed. He offered the box to his mother as a gift. According to his account, she suffered a sudden stroke the same day she received it. She recovered, but was unable to speak for a time, communicating only by writing 2 words, "hate gift." The story began to take on weight. Manus, disturbed by the events, attempted to give the cabinet away, but each new recipient reported unusual experiences: illness, insomnia, inexplicable shadows. The box always seemed to return, unwanted. No one kept it for long. Eventually, Kevin Manus turned to eBay, posting the cabinet for auction with a detailed description of the events surrounding it. His listing wasn't just a sales pitch, it was a narrative. Written in a careful, unfolding tone, it described the cabinet's background, its strange phenomena, and a plea that the buyer understand what they were taking on. He titled it, The Dybbuk Box. The listing went viral. Paranormal forums lit up. Readers debated the story's authenticity. Some claimed to experience unease just from reading the post. Others swore their devices began malfunctioning after viewing the images. The box sold to a university student named Ayasi Naitsky, who reported his own series of strange disturbances. Then it passed to another owner, and another. The myth grew, and with it, the legend of Manus himself. But over the years, questions began to surface. Journalists reached out to examine the box. Skeptics probed the timeline. And eventually, Kevin Manus would admit something important. The story, as it had first appeared, was partially invented. He described it as an interactive horror story, something between folklore and performance art. He didn't deny that he had crafted many elements of the tale, thought he had drawn from his own Jewish heritage and the structure of old ghost stories. But he also insisted that some of the experiences, his and others, were genuine, or at least felt genuine at the time. The Dybbuk Box, then, lives in a liminal space, half artifact, half invention. It is not an ancient object wrapped in sacred warnings, nor is it entirely a hoax. It's something more complicated, a modern folklore experiment born in the early days of internet storytelling. Manus, for his part, has always insisted that the box is not evil. In his own retellings, it is not a horror prop, but a reflection, a vessel for memory, trauma, and spiritual unrest, both real and imagined. A kind of mirror for the person encountering it. Later, the box would come into the possession of paranormal collectors Zach Bagans, host of the TV show Ghost Adventures. It would appear in his Las Vegas museum, sealed in a glass case, sometimes shown to guests under strict conditions. It was featured in a television special. Even celebrities, like rapper Post Malone, were linked to the object, further fueling its mythos. But at the center of it all, there is still Kevin Manus, a man who understood the power of narrative, who gave form to a ghost not found in old texts, but built from fragments of real history, personal imagination, and a quiet pool of folklore. He once described the Dybbuk Box not as a container of a spirit, but as a container of story. And maybe that's what makes it so enduring, because the moment you hear about it, it becomes part of your imagination. You begin to wonder, what if there's something real behind it all? What if a story, told with enough conviction, becomes its own kind of truth? The Dybbuk Box, then, is not simply cursed, it is believed into existence. And now, as we step away from the shop counter and the computer screen, we shift our gaze to those whose stories rarely make headlines. Two communities where tales of possession and spiritual unrest were not entertainment, but real fears, where labels like curse had consequences. Let's now take a quiet walk through those communities, through the rhythm of daily life, where belief, stigma, and survival intertwined. Imagine yourself walking through a narrow street in a small Eastern European village. Sometime in the 1860s, the morning fog is low and quiet. It's curling around the corners of stone cottages and creeping gently beneath wooden eaves. A rooster calls from somewhere in the distance. The smell of wet earth, boiled grain, and wood smoke clings to the chill in the air. This is Esteto, a Jewish settlement of no more than a few hundred people. Life here is cyclical, communal, and close. Families share ovens. Neighbors pass down stories. Everyone knows everyone else. Names, habits, history. Privacy is rare, and identity is inseparable from reputation. In this world, belief is not ornamental, it is essential. Faith runs deep, not just in prayers and scriptures, but in how people interpret the world around them. A bad harvest might be seen as divine punishment, a broken engagement as the echo of a forgotten promise, an unexplained illness as something more than physical. This is the world in which the Dybbuk emerges. Kir, a person who changes suddenly, a man who begins to mutter to himself, a woman who stops eating or who laughs at things no one else can hear, might be said to be afflicted. Kaya, not by demons in the Christian sense, but by something subtler. A soul, perhaps, Kai. Spirit seeking something unfinished, Kai. The word Dybbuk itself means clinging. It is not necessarily evil, but it is unsettled. A wandering soul that is not passed on properly, and instead attaches itself to the living, often to someone emotionally or spiritually vulnerable. But in a community as small and tightly woven as the shtetl, the arrival of a Dybbuk meant more than just spiritual concern. It meant disruption, discomfort, and often blame. Because when something unusual happened, when someone grew ill without explanation, when cattle refused to breed, when a child had seizures or night terrors, people looked for meaning, for a cause. And too often, the answer pointed to the person already seen as different. Perhaps a widow who lived alone at the edge of town. Perhaps a girl who had resisted marriage, or a boy who had always seemed distant. These individuals could easily become the focus of fear, less because they were dangerous, and more because their difference disturbed the order of things. In such cases, the Dybbuk became a kind of social metaphor. The afflicted person might be labeled possessed. It was not always said aloud. Sometimes it was just a look, a whisper, a space left empty at a wedding table. The rituals that followed varied by region. In some towns, the local rabbi might be called to examine the person. He would listen gently for signs, voices, sudden changes in language or behavior, uncanny knowledge. If the symptoms matched what tradition described, a ritual might be performed. Exorcisms in Jewish tradition were not violent. There was no shouting, no fire. Rather, it was a solemn, deeply spiritual process. Psalms were recited. Sacred names of God were invoked. The spirit would be addressed with respect, asked why it remained, and what it needed to move on. Witnesses might gather in a candlelit room, heads bowed, hearts steady. They were not casting out evil, they were guiding a soul home, helping it cross a threshold it had somehow missed. And yet, not every Dybbuk story ended in peace. Sometimes, the possession did not pass. The afflicted individual was isolated. Families might find themselves quietly avoided at the market, whispered about during synagogue services. Superstition hung in the air like dust, fine, hard to see, but difficult to clean away. There are historical records, often buried in rabbinical letters and community journals, of brides being abandoned after being thought to be possessed, of children removed from school, elderly women forced to live apart, even when the rituals were performed, even when the spirit was declared gone. The shadow it left could be long. Modern psychology would later reinterpret many of these cases: depression, epilepsy, schizophrenia, grief. But at the time, none of these terms existed in the communities where Dybbuk stories thrived. Instead, there was belief, came both comfort and danger. Because sometimes the idea of a Dybbuk provided meaning, even solace, a way of understanding loss or making sense of pain. But other times, it turned into a sentence, a stigma, a wound left not on the body, but on the person's place in the world, particularly for women. In many recorded stories, the Dybbuk entered the body of a young woman, often before marriage. These tales are rich with symbolism, spiritual conflict, suppressed desire, familial pressure. Some scholars suggest that possession became a way for women to express distress in a society that left them few other options. When a girl protested a marriage she didn't want, she might be labeled hysterical. If she fell ill, it might be said that a dead lover's soul had returned. In some communities, the answer was spiritual cleansing. In others, the girl was simply hidden away, and even after the rituals, her life might never return to what it was. Families had to live with the lingering association of the Dybbuk. Even if belief faded with time, the memory of the incident remained. All of this speaks to the burden belief could carry in close-knit communities, not because people were cruel, but because they were afraid. And in the face of fear, stories are powerful, but stories can also trap. They can become boxes in which people are placed, shut away, and labeled as cursed, different, or dangerous. And once those boxes are sealed, they can be hard to open again. This is perhaps the deeper truth behind the Dybbuk Box legend. Not that spirits live in cabinets, but that fear lives in narratives. That pain, especially unspoken pain, will find ways to be heard, whether through ritual or rumor or the steady creak of superstition. And yet, there is also a resilience in these stories. There is memory, there is ritual, there is care. In the very act of naming suffering, even in imperfect ways, these communities were trying to offer guidance, to create boundaries, to give shape to what felt shapeless. Tonight, as we leave behind the snowy lanes and candlelit homes of the shtetl, let us carry with us not just the weight of fear, but the flicker of understanding. That at the heart of every ghost story, there is a human story, a life that didn't fit, a soul that wandered, a voice that wanted to be heard. And now, we turn at last to the oldest layers of the Dybbuk legend, not the haunted cabinet or the online myth, but the true folklore that gave rise to it all, the texts, the prayers, the beliefs passed from lips to paper to memory. Imagine yourself sitting at a wooden table in a candlelit study, surrounded by quiet. The window is open just slightly, letting in the cool night air. A stack of ancient books lies beside you, bound in worn leather, their spines cracked with use. You turn the pages slowly, carefully, and the words reveal something not frightening, but thoughtful, deeply spiritual, measured. This is not, this is Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. Not a branch of occultism, but a centuries-old body of teachings that seeks to explain the relationship between the divine and the human, the spiritual and the material. In this space, belief is not dramatic or theatrical. It is steady, meditative, concerned less with spectacle than with meaning. And it is here, within the folds of Kabbalistic texts and oral traditions, that the Dybbuk quietly dwells. The Dybbuk, as we now understand it, is not a demon, not an evil creature sent to torment. In Jewish folklore, particularly from the 16th century onward, it is seen as a dislocated soul. A person who has died, but for some reason, often spiritual imbalance or unfinished duty, has not moved on to the afterlife. This soul, in its unrest, may attach itself to a living person, not out of vengeance, but from desperation. These teachings often come from the school of Isaac Luria, a great Kabbalist of 16th century saved, whose influence on Jewish mystical thought cannot be overstated. According to Lurianic Kabbalah, the universe is made of divine sparks, and our purpose as humans is to help restore cosmic balance, what is known as tikkun olam, or repair of the world. When a soul becomes trapped between worlds, clinging to the material realm, it is seen as a sign that something in the spiritual order has gone unresolved. The soul is not malevolent. It is stuck, lost, in need of release. The concept is tender, even sacred, and the ritual designed to remove the Dybbuk, when performed by a rabbi trained in mystical practice, is not violent. It is structured, built on prayer, language, and focused spiritual energy. A typical ceremony might involve the blowing of the shofar, a ram's horn, used on high holy days to awaken the soul. Psalms are recited. Names of God are spoken aloud, invoking divine presence and clarity. The spirit is addressed directly, often asked why it remains. Witnesses may be present, not to gawk, but to support, to lend the strength of community. These rituals are exceedingly rare, and they are approached with the utmost seriousness and compassion. Nothing about the historical Dybbuk resembles modern horror films or viral internet myths. The idea that such a spirit could be captured in a wine cabinet or sealed with wax and string has no precedent in Jewish folklore. Objects might be blessed or used symbolically in ritual, but the notion of physically binding a Dybbuk into a container is an invention of modern imagination, not rabbinic tradition. This doesn't mean that objects cannot carry spiritual weight. In Jewish thought, memory lives in things. A pair of candlesticks passed down through generations, a mezuzah on the doorframe, a crumbling prayer book used during wartime. These objects are not haunted, but they are saturated with significance. They hold the echoes of hands, voices, hopes. And in this way, perhaps, the Dybbuk Box speaks more to modern longing than ancient reality. It reflects a desire to contain what cannot be contained: grief, fear, spiritual unrest, to give form to the formless, to point to a box and say, this is where it lives. But tradition offers a gentler view. In traditional Jewish belief, the soul, neshama, is layered. There are parts of the soul that connect to the body, and parts that reach upward toward the divine. When a soul becomes a Dybbuk, it is not lost forever. It is redeemable, restorable, and the process of healing is communal. It may involve the afflicted person, the rabbi, the family, the congregation, sometimes even the soul's descendants. Okay? The goal is not destruction, but return, not fear, but repair. Compare this to the myth of the Dybbuk Box, which thrives on isolation. The object is hidden, feared, watched through glass, approached with gloves and anxiety. The king, the traditional Dybbuk, by contrast, is invited to speak. Its presence is acknowledged. His story is told. And only then, through compassion and structure, is it released. This contrast speaks to the difference between folklore and myth and the commodified ghost story. One is slow, inherited, deeply layered with meaning. The other is fast, viral, meant to thrill. Neither is wrong, exactly, but they serve different purposes. The Dybbuk Box myth, while based loosely on historical ideas, has more in common with the genre of haunted object narratives like cursed dolls, mirrors, or paintings. These stories echo back to Victorian spiritualism, Gothic horror, and even older tales of enchanted relics. But the real Dybbuk is less theatrical and more deeply human. It is about the ache of unfinished business, the sorrow that lingers, the soul that clings. It is about recognizing that not all suffering is visible, and that not all ghosts wear chains. Tonight, as the rain continues to fall and your eyes grow heavy, remember this: the Dybbuk is not a thing to fear. It is a metaphor to understand. Not everything that clings is cursed. Some things hold on because they are waiting to be heard, to be remembered, to be let go. And so, as we close the final page on this story, let us return to the present, not with fear, but with quiet reverence for the way stories shape our world. And now, the story draws to a close. You've walked with me through dimly lit antique shops and snow-dusted village roads. You've stood beside a storyteller in Portland, Oregon, sat quietly among candle flames and prayer books in centuries-old synagogues. You've opened a box, not of wood, but of memory, of fear, of meaning, and peeked gently inside. What we found wasn't a monster, not a ghost that knocks or howls, but something more human, more patient, more real. The Dybbuk, in its oldest form, is not a creature of nightmares, but of stories. It is sorrow misunderstood, grief unspoken, a spirit caught between where it has been and where it needs to go, and the box, the now famous cabinet, passed from hand to hand. It holds no confirmed evil, only narrative, belief, curiosity. It is an object that became heavy with the weight of human imagination. Perhaps the most powerful curses are not in objects at all, but in what we choose not to heal. In the spaces where pain lingers, in the stories we inherit without questioning, in the things we fear to name. Tonight, as your breathing slows and the rhythm of the rain becomes part of the silence around you, you can let go of the mystery. You can let go of the box, the ghost, the worry that something ancient is watching, because the real truth is this: you are here. You are safe, okay? And the night holds nothing you cannot face, okay? If tonight's story gave you something to think about, something calming, curious, or gently strange, please consider subscribing to the channel. A simple like or comment lets me know you're out there, listening in the dark. And I'd love to know where you're joining me from. Until next time, rest well. Let the box stay closed. Let the spirit move on, okay? And let the stories softly return to sleep. Good night. Hello, and welcome to another quiet journey into history's forgotten corners, where the strange, the solemn, and the simply exhausting rhythms of daily life unfold like soft pages in the dark. You're listening to boring and strange sleep stories, where the rain is steady, the past is patient, and everything you hear is designed to help your mind rest while it gently wanders. Tonight, we step behind the gates of the Roman Empire. Not into the palaces or temples you may imagine, but beneath the noise, beneath the arena, into the quiet, structured, and often misunderstood world of the gladiator. We all think we know what it meant to be a gladiator: blood, sand, roars of 1,000 voices. But what if I told you it was also about contracts, calories, corporate training regimens, and the precise legal balance between slave and celebrity? What if the arena was less of a slaughterhouse and more of a spectacle machine? Tonight's journey is called Why You Wouldn't Last a Day as a Roman Gladiator, and we'll explore not just the brutality, but the bizarre bureaucracy behind the blade. Leave me a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy hearing from listeners across the world, settling in with their tea, their blankets, and a mind ready to drift. Now, take a deep breath. Let the sound of rain carry you. But imagine yourself walking through a narrow alley in ancient Rome, not toward the Colosseum as a tourist, but as an investment. Imagine yourself beneath the warm weight of the Mediterranean sun, not on a villa terrace, not among the marble steps of a senator's house, but in the shadow of high stone walls, where the clink of chains is nearly drowned out by the practiced thud of sandals on packed earth. You are near a gladiator school, okay? A ludus, a place not of chaos, but of order, not of wild death, but of discipline, contracts, and care. A place where some of the most dangerous men in the empire sleep in rows, eat in silence, and fight not for freedom, but for routine, for survival, and sometimes for spectacle. We begin not with the clash of blades, but with something quieter: paperwork, or rather, the Roman version of it. Contracts written in neat script, sometimes scratched into tablets or etched into wax, okay? These were binding agreements between a man and a state, or, more often, between a man and a lanista, the owner and operator of a gladiator school. Many who entered these schools were enslaved, yes, prisoners of war, criminals, or debtors, but not all. Some came by choice, signing contracts that traded freedom for food, structure, and a strange kind of fame. These octorati, or volunteer gladiators, often did so for money, or out of desperation, or even out of boredom. Rome, after all, was a place where ambition and ruin often lived side by side. And when they signed that contract, they gave up everything: control of their diet, control of their movements, even their names. From that moment on, they belonged not to themselves, but to the ludus and to the lanista who ran it, okay? These schools were more than training grounds. They were economic machines. Kay's gladiator was a walking investment, a set of expenses and potential earnings, okay? Food was carefully rationed. Sleep was scheduled, okay? training was mandatory, and every injury was calculated, evaluated, not for its pain, but for its cost. The diet of a gladiator might surprise you. It wasn't lean meats and sculpted physiques, as popular imagery might suggest. Instead, it was heavy in barley porridge, legumes, and dried fruit, a starchy, high-energy diet that promoted the growth of a protective fat layer, useful not only for storing energy, but also for absorbing glancing blows. In this way, the human body became part of the business model, designed not for speed, but for drama. And while these fighters lived under constant supervision, they were not tortured or neglected. That would have been wasteful. Instead, they were managed meticulously. There were physicians on staff, herbal remedies for swelling, compresses made of vinegar and herbs, primitive stitching for open wounds. Physicians became experts not only in healing, but in identifying which wounds could be shown to the crowd and which must be hidden. The illusion of invincibility was good for morale and for marketing. Popular gladiators had fans. Sometimes children carved their names into walls. Women sent love notes, even offerings. Some fighters had nicknames: the Sand Wolf, the Lightning Arm, the Painted Death. And with a few victories under their belt, these men could become minor celebrities. But again, it was all part of the system. The Lanista kept records of each fighter's performance, wins and losses, injuries, behavioral notes, preferred fighting styles. The school functioned like a military camp with touches of a modern athletic club. And within the rigid hierarchy, certain fighters rose to the rank of instructors, doctors, experienced veterans who trained the newer recruits. These doctors were respected, sometimes feared, and often more loyal to the ludus than to their fellow fighters. The weapons themselves were standardized. Each style of fighter, Threx, Marmillo, Bracharius, had its own assigned gear. A Threx might carry a curved blade and a small shield, a Marmillo, a heavy helmet with a visor and a gladius. Thorioris fought without a helmet, armed only with a net and trident, relying on speed and distance. It was not a matter of choice. Fighters were assigned their roles based on size, build, and aptitude. The matches were designed with symmetry in mind. Balance, variety, contrast, and always spectacle. You might picture the arena as a place of chaos, but behind the scenes, everything was rehearsed and regulated, even death. A gladiator who was gravely wounded might appeal to the editor of the games, the presiding authority, often a magistrate or sponsor. A gesture, a raised finger, a glance toward the box, and the editor would decide life or death, but not arbitrarily. Often the crowd had influence. The crowd favored fighters they recognized, admired, or pitied. A man who had fought bravely and bled convincingly was often spared to fight another day. Even the deaths were part of the theater. A clean blow, a noble fall, a swift end, and then the next match. Behind all of it, ledgers, ink, and sand. If a gladiator died in the arena, the Lanista might receive compensation, essentially insurance for a lost investment, a fixed amount, set in advance. The higher the rank of the fighter, the higher the payout. And so the ludus operated with the strange dual nature of all Roman institutions, part brutal, part brilliant. It was organized, rational, and completely indifferent. The fighters who lived there might go months without seeing the sun. They might be trained to kill, but not allowed to leave their cells after dark. They might win glory in the arena, only to fall ill from a fever in the cold dormitories below. They were commodities, and they knew it, and yet they trained. They learned. Some found meaning in it. Some even thrived. And when the time came, they marched out onto the sand beneath a million eyes, to bleed on cue, to earn survival, to give Rome what it loved most. The illusion of control over life and death. Now, let us step into that world through the eyes of its most famous rebel, a man who wore the chains and chose to break them. Let's now draw the curtain aside, turn our attention to the most enduring name in gladiatorial history, Spartacus. The very name carries echoes. You might picture a rebel, a warrior, a defiant shout against tyranny. But tonight, we'll take a quieter walk through his life, step by measured step, not as a symbol, but as a man. One who never asked to become a legend, one who knew the taste of dust, of barley porridge, of sweat, and of silence. Let us begin in the midst of Thrace. Spartacus was likely born sometime around the early 1st century BC in the region we now call Bulgaria. Back then, Thrace was a contested land, known more for its warriors than for its peace, place of highlands and rugged forests, where tribes lived in a delicate rhythm with the seasons and with one another. He may have been a soldier once, or a deserter, or even a border scout for the Roman army who later fell into disfavor. The ancient sources don't agree. Plutarch offers one version, Appian another, and yet another emerges in Florus. But what they all seem to agree on is that Spartacus was captured, enslaved, transported to Italy, sold. Imagine that journey, bound, disoriented, brought from the wide skies of the Balkan mountains into the ordered stone silence of Roman streets, a life narrowed from possibility to punishment. Eventually, Spartacus was sent to Capua, to the ludus of Lentulus Batiatus, one of Rome's well-connected Lanistas. This was no crude holding cell. This was a training facility, proving ground, and a crucible. It was here that Spartacus became a gladiator, not just in body, but in designation. He would have been measured, assessed, assigned a style, handed equipment, and then the routine would begin. Drills, endurance runs. Practice with wooden swords, hour after hour, until the difference between motion and instinct disappeared. And yet, within this controlled, bureaucratic environment, something began to stir. No one can say for certain why Spartacus rebelled. Perhaps it was a matter of survival. Perhaps he overheard whispers of an unjust punishment, or saw too many die before their time. Or perhaps he simply reached a quiet point beyond fear. In 73 BCE, alongside a small group of fellow trainees, some say 70, others say closer to 200, Spartacus broke free. They fought their way out of the school using kitchen tools at first, seizing whatever they could. They overtook wagons, confiscated arms, disappeared into the countryside. What followed was not a simple escape. It became something far more inconvenient for Rome. A rebellion, a movement. Other enslaved people began to join them. At first, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. They moved south, then doubled back north, set up camp, raided estates, confounded local militias. For over 2 years, Rome struggled to suppress them. Spartacus did not fight alone. He shared leadership with 2 other gladiators, Crixus and Enemas, each a fighter, each with different visions of what their rebellion could be. Some wanted to flee Italy entirely, to return home across the Alps. Others wanted to stay and punish their former captors. Spartacus, according to many sources, leaned toward escape. He wasn't seeking to overturn the Republic. He was trying to break free of it, but as numbers swelled, so did complications. Thousands of people needed food, shelter, strategy, and more than that, unity. That is the quiet tragedy of rebellion. It asks people to become more than angry. It asks them to become organized. Eventually, the Roman Senate took notice. They dispatched general after general, each more seasoned than the last. At first, these commanders underestimated the rebels. They were defeated, embarrassed, but in 71 BCE, Rome sent Marcus Licinius Crassus, wealthy, ruthless, and politically hungry. Crassus built a wall to trap the rebels in the southernmost part of Italy, a literal trench, a barrier between freedom and annihilation. Spartacus tried to break through. Some of his followers did. Others were caught, and finally, in a brutal, fog-choked battle, the rebellion ended. Spartacus disappeared into history at that point. No body was ever identified, no grave discovered. Some say he fell honorably, sword in hand. Others whispered that he escaped, quietly vanishing into the mountains, nameless again. The surviving rebels, about 6,000 men, were crucified along the Appian Way, one every few dozen steps. A road lined not with trees, but with warnings. Rome had reasserted its order. But the story of Spartacus never really faded. Over time, it grew taller, louder, less human, and more men. He became a figure of resistance, a champion of the enslaved, a metaphor for dignity in the face of control. But before the banners and the bronze statues, he was just a man, a Thracian soldier, a slave, a fighter, a spy perhaps, in the stillness of night when you think of him, not in a crowd, but alone. You can almost hear the rhythm of his footsteps in the dust, deliberate, measured, not marching to war, but walking away from chains. Now, let's step deeper, not into a myth, but into the reality of what it was like to wake beneath the arena itself. You wake before sound, before the first footsteps echo across the stone corridor, before the guards rattle the iron doors, before the heat rises from the earth. Lie still, eyes open in the dimness. The ceiling above you is low, the stone cool and damp with the breath of night. Round you, the slow shuffle of other bodies, men, silent, still heavy with sleep. The soft shift of straw, a cough, quiet prayer murmured into the dark. This is not a prison, not exactly. It is something quieter, more routine, more exacting. This is a carcer, a holding cell beneath the arena, a place meant for waiting, for preparation, for endurance. The air is heavy with sweat, oil, and iron. Your nose is used to it now. The scent of worn leather, dull steel, oiled grains. Somewhere farther off, someone sharpens a blade. You can hear it, a soft, repetitive scrape. Not hurried, not angry, just steady. You sit up slowly, the chill of the stone beneath your feet. Your joints ache. The bruises from yesterday's training still bloom beneath your skin, but they are ordinary now. Background noise. You do not notice them. This is a day like the others, okay? And yet, not quite. You already know, without being told. Today, you are scheduled to fight. There is no announcement, no dramatic call. The routine is enough. The rhythm of this place is predictable, like breath. Wake, eat, wait, dress, fight, return, sleep, repeat. You dress first in silence. A simple linen tunic. The cloth is scratchy against your skin, but you are used to that. You bind your feet with strips of wool, worn soft at the heels. There is a basin of water nearby, cold, metallic tasting, but clean enough to splash across your face and neck. You do so without thinking. These movements are no longer choices. They are habits, carved deep into your muscles. You don't speak to the others. No one does. They are preparing to inwardly. Eyes closed, breathing slow. Some rock gently back and forth, others pace. One man traces invisible patterns on the floor with his toe. Perhaps a ritual, perhaps distraction. The hours pass slowly, as they always do. The stone cell does not change. The world above stirs, but you remain still beneath it, unnoticed and necessary. Eventually, the footsteps come, booted, measured, intentional. 2 guards, Tatar, and behind them, the armorers. They call your name, not the name your mother gave you, but the one the Lanista chose. A name meant for shouting, 4 coins tossed in the sand, 4 poems scratched onto wine cups. You do not love it, but you answer to it. You rise. You are not alone in this. Others are called too. But today is your turn. In the adjacent chamber, You were dressed for the arena. First, the subligaculum, a short garment wrapped tight at the waist, the foundation of your uniform. Over that, layers of padding, thick linen wraps around your arms and legs, meant to absorb impact, not to protect from piercing. The armor comes next, segmentata, or sometimes boiled leather hardened with wax. A man fastens your greaves. Another ties your helmet, the leather strap rough under your chin. It narrows your vision, limits your breath. You've worn it many times before. A sword is placed in your hand. Not your personal blade. There is no such thing but one balanced, honed, oiled. You flex your fingers around the hilt. Not because you're nervous, because you need to remember its weight. Then you are led forward, not paraded, simply moved. You walk through a narrow tunnel lit by torches and iron sconces. The walls close in around you, and the air shifts. It's warmer now, drier. You can smell dust. Not the dust of roads or markets, but arena dust. It's paired sand churned by thousands of footsteps, sand stained by thousands of matches. You hear the crowd before you see them. A murmur first, then a roar. But above it all, the measured beat of the announcer's voice, a list of names, styles, sponsorships, wagers. The gates rise. You step forward. Light hits you in the eyes, bright, sharp, and sudden. You squint, adjusting. The sky above the arena is high and white with morning glare. The stands rise around you, layered with rows of seated spectators, some in linen, some in purple. Children sit on stone ledges. Vendors shout beneath awnings. Doves circle overhead, startled by the fanfare. The arena sand is soft beneath your feet, raked smooth in wide spirals by slaves with large wooden combs. It is almost beautiful, this symmetry. You feel eyes on you, thousands, tens of thousands, some watching idly, others whispering, excited, some already calling for blood, others looking only for a distraction from the heat. Across the sand, your opponent emerges. You don't know him, not his name, not his past. You read him by stance, by breath, by gear. You salute the editor, an older man in a broad-brimmed hat, seated near the imperial box. He nods, barely. The signal is given. The fight begins. But it is not chaos. It is not anger. It is not passion. It is calm, a dance. You move with precision, not fury. You know the reach of your arm, the weight of your shield, the rhythm of your feet on sand. Your opponent circles. You respond to exchange blows, not wild, but practiced. Each movement learned through repetition, each feint tested 100 times. There's no noise in your head, only timing, only breath, and then an opening, a strike, fall. You are still standing. You raise your arm, not in victory, but in procedure. The editor decides. The crowd reacts. Today, mercy is granted. Your opponent is dragged away. You are told to return. You walk slowly back toward the gate. The noise recedes behind you. The sun at your back. Your breath still even. Your limbs still intact. Back in the cell, the straw feels softer somehow. You sit, you eat, you close your eyes. Tomorrow is uncertain, but this moment is yours. You have survived. For now, the arena above you continues its show, but beneath it, you rest, again, wrapped in silence, stone and sweat, and above it all, history waits, buried in layers of dust and bone. Let us turn, not to legend, but to evidence, quiet and impartial. Let us step into the laboratories and excavation pits where modern archaeologists sift through time to find what remains of lives like yours, beneath the dust of time, beneath the amphitheaters and villas, the aqueducts and temples, beneath the echo of empire, lie the quiet remains of the fighters Rome tried not to remember. The teeth, the bones, they are buried beneath layers of soil and centuries of forgetting. They do not speak, but they tell stories. Archaeologists, working in careful grids and with steady brushes, have uncovered entire gladiator cemeteries. One of the most well-known was found in Ephesus, in what is now western Turkey, once a bustling Roman city. Long quieted by the centuries, here, in rows beneath dry earth, the bodies lay, not in mass graves, not dumped, but arranged, respectfully, professionally. And this, perhaps more than anything, changes how we understand the gladiators' place. For all their suffering, all their showmanship, they were often buried with care, some with markers, some with offerings, many with signs of repeated injury and of survival. In one grave, researchers found a man whose skull had been pierced by a blade from above, clean, decisive, and likely fatal. In another, a man with a fractured arm that had healed, a pelvis with deep puncture marks, survivable, but lasting, multiple ribs showing signs of regrowth after breaks. The injuries tell us something else, that these men weren't dying immediately. They were being treated. They were being preserved. X-rays and CT scans show bone remodeling, evidence of medical attention, of surgeries, however primitive, of life after the arena, even if brief. Some bones showed signs of infection, others of overuse, the repetitive strain of training etched into the very calcium of their frames, ankles warped by constant pivoting, elbows thickened from years of shield impact, shoulders rounded from carrying weight. Their skeletons had adapted, gradually reshaped by labor and discipline. Their lives had left impressions, not just on the sands of the Colosseum, but within their very marrow. And then there is the diet. Through a process called isotopic analysis, scientists can determine what a person ate based on the chemical traces in their bones. Gladiators, unlike wealthier Romans, consumed unusually high levels of plant-based meals. This confirms ancient texts describing the hordery, or barley man. Their diet consisted mainly of grains, legumes, and ash. Yes, ash. Charcoal, or plant ash, was consumed as a kind of tonic, rich in calcium. It was thought to strengthen the body and promote recovery. Modern analysis confirms this. Gladiators had stronger bones, denser skeletons, and signs of rapid growth and healing. Their bodies were being maintained deliberately. This was not a population left to waste. They were, in effect, managed assets, and their biology reflects that careful control. Even their teeth have stories. Many gladiator remains show chipped or worn teeth, not from age, but from using them to grip gear or open fastenings. The front teeth, especially, often display were patterns found in those who regularly bit down on leather. There is something hauntingly human in that. You imagine a man sitting in a quiet moment before a match, chewing on a leather strap to calm himself, perhaps tightening the cords on his armor with his teeth, perhaps pulling off a glove, and that gesture, so small, so familiar, remains, thousands of years later, in the enamel of his remains. These are the stories the arena forgot to tell. Not the clashes, not the cheers, but the after. The bruised bones that mended, the knees worn thin by kneeling, the backs curved from years of carrying shields. It's the lives that endured, not just in spectacle, but in soreness. And then, the graves. Some gladiators were buried with care. Others were sent to communal plots, but many were returned to their schools, buried in cemeteries just beyond the walls of the ludi that trained them. In one such graveyard, an epitaph was found. Here lies Marcus, who fought bravely in 10 matches. Freed by his master, he chose to stay. He died with honor, a quiet testament, a footnote in stone, but it tells us something more valuable than legend, that gladiators were not only victims or rebels, they were men. Some loyal, some angry, some tired, some proud. The bones tell us they were fed, trained, tended, that they lived through injuries that would fail most soldiers, that they adapted, that they formed bonds, and sometimes they endured. They do not tell us what the men dreamed or whether they regretted their path, but they suggest that life, even beneath the arena, was more than just survival. It was routine, it was repetition, it's discipline. It was, in some strange way, a kind of purpose, and when the bones are laid back into the earth, measured, catalogued, understood, the silence returns. But it is a softer silence now, because what once seemed like chaos was in fact deeply structured. What once felt like spectacle was someone's daily life. And what we once imagined as the end was, sometimes, only the middle. And now the torches have dimmed. The sand is still. The crowds have gone home. And above the cells in stone, the city sleeps. You have walked through a world built on paradox. A place where death was choreographed, where honor could grow from enslavement, and where violence was managed with paperwork and precision. You have seen the morning routine of the ludus, where the scent of olive oil and boiled barley greeted each sunrise. You've trained with wooden swords and waited in stone corridors, felt the weight of armor not as drama, but as obligation. You stood under the arena's glare, not as a hero, but as a contract. You watched as Spartacus, before the legends, stepped out of his chains. Not as a symbol, but as a man with a plan, a hesitation, a purpose that changed shape over time. He did not begin with revolution in mind. He began with survival, and beneath all of it, buried deep in the quiet earth, bones whisper stories without anger, without judgment. They remind us that pain leaves marks, that routine builds resilience, and that even lives framed in spectacle were lived slowly, day by day. Okay? Being a gladiator wasn't about rage. It wasn't about glory. It was about being used and still choosing to rise. And so, as you settle now, wherever you are, beneath your own roof, with your own name, your own breath, you can feel the distance between then and now. No stone floor, no straw mattress, no waiting for a fight, only quiet, only rest, only the knowledge that even the loudest ages pass and leave behind only echoes in the dust. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Rome's most misunderstood profession. You're still awake. I hope your eyes are heavy, and if not, let your dreams carry you far from the arena and deep into the peace of history's forgotten quiet. Please consider subscribing to Strange Sleep Stories for more gentle journeys into the odd and overlooked corners of our past, and leave me a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. It's always a pleasure to imagine the far-flung, quiet corners of this strange little world. Good night, and may your rest be as calm as the sand after the fight. Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history. It's a place where the odd, the ordinary, and the oddly ordinary mingle beneath the soft hush of time. Tonight, we invite you to step into the dim light of a long-forgotten shop, one that smells faintly of dried lavender, crushed roots, vinegar, and beeswax, a place where bundles of herbs hang from the rafters like chandeliers of dried foliage, where wooden drawers are labeled with strange names, some Latin, some simply hopeful. This is the world of the medieval apothecary, though it may seem quaint from the comfort of modern medicine. The life of a medieval apothecary, and those who depended on one, was anything but easy. Beneath the mortar and pestle, the tinkling glass, and handwritten scrolls was a delicate balance of hope and guesswork, of observation and folklore, of science barely beginning and superstition refusing to end. In tonight's story, we'll explore 4 gently unfolding chapters. First, we'll walk through the curious past of early medicine, a time before science had rules, but remedies still had rituals. Then we'll meet a real historical figure, a woman whose work as an herbalist quietly reshaped her community and unknowingly risked everything. Next, you'll find yourself in the rhythm of a single day inside a working apothecary. The slow preparation of tinctures, the requests from neighbors, the worry in their eyes. And finally, we'll explore what truly worked and what didn't through the lens of modern science. So, Wherever you are tonight, perhaps tucked in with the rain tapping your windows, or maybe dozing with the soft sound of traffic in the distance, I invite you to relax. Let go of the day behind you and drift back into another time. And if you enjoy these stories, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps this little shop of strange tales keep its doors open. Leave me a comment letting me know where you're listening from tonight. Now, gently, we begin. Imagine a street so narrow that two carts cannot pass side by side. The stones underfoot are rounded, slick with age, and uneven from centuries of wear. You hear the soft clip of hooves, a wheel creaking slowly around a bend, and above that, faintly, the sound of bells chiming the hour from some distant tower. The scent in the air is layered and curious. There's the smoke of peat from a chimney nearby, the sourness of a tannery just out of sight, and mingled within it, something more curious, a faint sweetness, the sharp edge of vinegar, the dry, grassy whisper of camelot. You follow that trail to a modest building nestled between a cooper shop and a weaver's stall. The sign swings gently on a rusted iron hinge, a carved image of a mortar and pestle, faded by time and weather. This is the apothecary shop. In this, for the sick, the hopeful, the superstitious, and the quietly desperate, is where healing begins. In the medieval world, illness was not simply a biological inconvenience. It was a spiritual burden, a sign from the heavens, a moral consequence. Understanding the body meant more than anatomy. It meant interpreting humors, celestial alignments, and the will of God. The foundations of medieval medicine stretched back to ancient sources. Galen, Hippocrates, Dioscorides, their ideas preserved in handwritten Latin, copied laboriously by monks. Their words were often more poetry than prescription, yet they held great sway. And for those few who could read, they provided a map of sorts. But in most towns and villages, there were no physicians. Universities were distant and closed to many. What remained was the apothecary, not always trained, but observant, skilled in plants, familiar with pain, attentive to patterns and to people. Step inside, and your eyes take a moment to adjust. The light is soft, filtered through parchment-colored windows or flickering candles. Shelves line the walls, crowded with glass vessels, sealed with wax or stoppered with cork. Drawers bear worn labels: pulvis, iris, radix, angelicae, folium, menthe, Latin for powdered iris, angelica root, and mint leaves. Strings of dried herbs hang from ceiling beams: sage, rue, yarrow, wormwood, tied with red thread to ward off spoilage, or spirits. To your left, a workbench, its surface stained from years of grinding, mixing, pouring. A mortar sits ready, its pestle beside it. Strip of parchment notes the correct preparation of elderflower tonic, good for colds and fevers, must be steeped before the hour of prayer. There is a rhythm here, a ritual, not just of measurement and mortar, but of belief. The medieval world viewed the human body through the lens of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health was the art of balance. Too much black bile, that was melancholy. Too little phlegm, that meant fever. Each remedy aimed not to cure as we know it, but to restore harmony. To draw out illness, purging was common through leeches, emetics, or bitter teas, saffron to warm the blood, cucumber seeds to cool it. But alongside these treatments lay an older knowledge, folk remedies passed down quietly through generations. A honey poultice for wounds, boiled nettle for aching joints, the juice of crushed garlic for infection. Not all effective, but not all useless either. And then there were the stranger prescriptions, a concoction of powdered toad, ashes of a burned raven's wing, water poured over a stone at midnight, gathered without being seen. To our modern sensibilities, these might seem absurd, but they were given with care and received with hope. The boundary between medicine and magic was porous, not because apothecaries were sorcerers, but because suffering defied logic, and people turned to whatever offered comfort. And so, an apothecary might offer a remedy and a charm, a bit of tea and a whispered prayer. The patient might cross themselves before drinking. A mother might hang a pouch of rosemary over her infant's cradle, not knowing if it healed or merely protected. It was not science as we know it, but it was structure, a quiet system in an uncertain world. Across Europe, apothecaries varied in status. In major cities, they organized into guilds, enforcing standards and apprenticeships. In smaller towns, they were solitary, sometimes respected, sometimes mistrusted. They faced scrutiny too. The fine line they walked between natural remedy and unnatural knowledge meant they were occasionally accused of sorcery, especially women, whose healing skills were often viewed with suspicion. But, despite the risks, the apothecary shop endured. Even today, archaeological digs sometimes uncover remnants of their trade. Glass alembics used in distillation, ceramic jars still faintly scented with herbs, tools for grinding and mixing. In one well-preserved site in France, layers of dried rose petals were found beneath floorboards, possibly spilled while crafting an infused oil. These quiet details speak volumes: the daily labor, the soft, careful hands, the measured hope that each mixture might help someone breathe a little easier, sleep a little deeper, or walk without pain. And so, the medieval apothecary stands as a figure of contradiction. It's learned but uncredentialed, respected but at risk, grounded in earth, yet shadowed by myth. In our next chapter, we'll meet a real woman who quietly practiced the apothecary's craft, tending to her village with knowledge passed from mother to daughter, until that knowledge became a danger. For now, take another breath, let the smell of dried rosemary and beeswax drift through your mind, and we'll turn the page together. As the faint scent of lavender and smoke lingers in the air, we shift now from the general world of the apothecary to a single, humble figure. A woman of no titles, no fame, and no marble bust to mark her memory. Her name was Agnes. She lived in a small village near Ely, the fens of East Anglia, a flat, damp region where the land seems to merge with the sky, where mist clings to the reeds in the early morning, and low stone churches rise quietly above the waterlogged fields. Agnes of Haddenham. She was not a noblewoman. She was not married into any great house. She was not known to kings or bishops. And yet, her name, just barely, survives the passing of centuries. Not because of her triumphs, but because of her troubles. Agnes was an herbalist, or, as some called her, a wise woman, a weaver of remedies, a keeper of plants. Imagine her life. Not a tale of grand drama, but a slow and steady rhythm, like the turning of the year itself. She rose early, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and stepped into the wet grass behind her home. There, she gathered plants, not for decoration, but for use: marigold and mint, comfrey root, and mugwort. She did not speak of active compounds. She did not need to. She knew what soothed the cough, what eased the aching of joints, and what cooled a fevered brow. In her small home, likely built of wattle and daub, its floor packed earth, its walls perfumed faintly by dried herbs and smoke, Agnes prepared her mixtures. She had no written guides. Her books were the seasons. Her notes were the quiet recollections passed down from her mother and her mother before her. She learned with her hands, her tongue, her nose. She tasted bitterness on the back of her tongue and remembered which teas it belonged to. She watched the color of a bruise fade after applying a poultice and adjusted the ratio of bark and resin for the next time. Her visitors came quietly. A mother with a fussy child, an older man who could no longer sleep, a young girl with a twisted ankle. Agnes listened, nodded, and worked. She rarely promised results, only effort. She charged little. Sometimes a chicken's egg, sometimes a measure of flour or a handful of wool, often nothing at all. For many years, this life continued unremarked. But things change, slowly. then all at once. In the early 14th century, the world around Agnes was growing harder. Harvests failed. Winters lengthened. There were whispers of plague in distant cities. The church grew more watchful, and fear, as it so often does, began to creep into the spaces where understanding was thin. Agnes helped a woman who had lost 3 children in 3 years, gave her herbs set to strengthen the womb, told her to drink them by candlelight when the moon was full. The woman bore a child, healthy. Some called it a blessing. Others wondered aloud if Agnes had changed her fate. That was dangerous thinking. Not long after, the wife of a local reeve, a minor official, fell ill. A swelling of the throat, a rattling in the lungs. Agnes came when summoned. She brewed thyme and horehound, simmered with honey and vinegar. The woman improved, then worsened. A week later, she died. Her family grieved, and then they accused. A document survives from the ecclesiastical court of Ely, a thin, cracking page, now held in the archives of a cathedral library, i.e., it refers to Agnes, a woman known to meddle with roots and unguents, whose knowledge is not of divine instruction, but of hidden and inherited ways. She was summoned to appear. We can imagine her journey, quiet steps down a dirt road, the sky overcast, her shawl pulled tighter against the wind. She likely entered the bishop's hall with her head bowed, the air smelling of parchment and damp wool. The questions would have been formal. Did she read the Bible? No, not in Latin. Did she offer healing? Yes, when asked. Did she use incantations? No, only prayers, she might have said, and words of comfort. There is no record of tears, no record of anger. She was not imprisoned, not burned. This was not yet the fire-soaked century of witch trials. But she was fined, a sum likely too great to afford. And she was warned, she must cease her remedies, cease speaking of plants, cease the practice of healing. We do not know what became of her after that. The records end. Perhaps she faded into quiet poverty. Perhaps she left the village. Perhaps she kept working more discreetly. But her story, what little we can piece together, is echoed in many others. Women who healed and were punished for it, not because they did harm, but because they knew too much and too little gained. Sin, her small cottage, surrounded by jars and stems and memories, stands now as a symbol of a kind of practitioner lost to time, a caretaker of knowledge that existed not in books, but in gardens, in touch, in memory. She was neither saint nor sinner, just a woman who tried to help. And as we leave her story behind, we return to the day-to-day world she once lived in, to the clink of a glass vial, the hiss of steam from a kettle, the steady rhythm of pestle on stone. In the next part of our journey, we will walk through a single day in the life of a medieval apothecary, a slow unfolding of tasks, visitors, worries, and the quiet faith that something in these drawers and bottles might actually work. Let the scent of rosemary linger a little longer, and we'll continue together. Not long after, the wife of a local reeve, a minor official, fell ill. A swelling of the throat, a rattling in the lungs. Agnes came when summoned. She brewed thyme and horehound, simmered with honey and vinegar. The woman improved, then worsened. A week later, she died. Her family grieved, and then they accused. A document survives from the ecclesiastical court of Ely, a thin, cracking page now held in the archives of a cathedral library. It refers to Agnes, a woman known to meddle with roots and unguents, whose knowledge is not of divine instruction, but of hidden and inherited ways. She was summoned to appear. We can imagine her journey, quiet steps down a dirt road, the sky overcast, her shawl pulled tighter against the wind. She likely entered the bishop's hall with her head bowed, the air smelling of parchment and damp wool. The questions would have been formal. Did she read the Bible? No, not in Latin. Did she offer healing? Yes, when asked. Did she use incantations? No, only prayers, she might have said, and words of comfort. There is no record of tears, no record of anger. She was not imprisoned, not burned. This was not yet the fire-soaked century of witch trials. But she was fined, a sum likely too great to afford. And she was warned. She must cease her remedies, cease speaking of plants, cease the practice of healing. We do not know what became of her after that. The records end. Perhaps she faded into quiet poverty. Perhaps she left the village. Perhaps she kept working more discreetly. But her story, what little we can piece together, is echoed in many others. Women who healed and were punished for it. Not because they did harm, but because they knew too much and too little. Canis, in her small cottage, surrounded by jars and stems and memories, stands now as a symbol of a kind of practitioner lost to time, a caretaker of knowledge that existed not in books, but in gardens, in touch, and memory. She was neither saint nor sinner, just a woman who tried to help. And as we leave her story behind, we return to the day-to-day world she once lived in, to the clink of a glass vial, the hiss of steam from a kettle, the steady rhythm of pestle on stone. In the next part of our journey, we will walk through a single day in the life of a medieval apothecary, a slow unfolding of tasks, visitors, worries, not the quiet faith that something in these drawers and bottles might actually work. Let the scent of rosemary linger a little longer, and we'll continue together. Elias nods, listening. He asks a few quiet questions. Does he cough blood? No. Does he wheeze when he breathes? Yes. He selects horehound, thyme, and licorice root. He pours hot water over the mixture in a stone bowl, lets it steep as he wraps a cloth of wool around it, a warm compress for the chest. He gives her instructions, gently. Let the herbs steep long. Give them before dusk. Keep him warm. A coin changes hands, though she winces as she parts with it. The shop falls quiet again. Outside, the town begins to wake. The creak of wheels, the soft call of a vendor, the distant clatter of hooves on stone. Within, Elias returns to his preparations. There's a boy who arrives every week to help, maybe 10 years old, with quick hands and a mind like dry earth soaking up water. Elias teaches as they work. How to strip bark without bruising it, how to crush seeds without losing their oils. The boy asks if he can taste the licorice root. Elias nods. It's sweet, strange, familiar. Later in the day, a priest visits, not for illness, but for supplies. He asks for lavender oil to soothe a restless novice, also vinegar, which the abbey uses to clean wounds. Elias adds a pinch of hyssop, not necessary, but welcome. The priest offers bread in trade. A child arrives near dusk, cheeks red from running, carrying a note. His mother has headaches, bad ones, worse near the fire. Elias gives him a small cloth bag filled with dried feverfew and instructions to brew it with milk, not water. Some customers believe in the herbs, others believe in a ritual. All hope it helps. As evening arrives, Elias tends to his tools. Washes his mortar, wipes down the counter with vinegar, checks the weights of his scale. He walks to the back garden, where a few hardy plants cling to life. Rosemary, winter savory, and boneset. He trims what he can, thanks the plants with a quiet thought, and returns indoors. The shutters are closed. The candle burns low. He sits at the table and opens a small wooden box. Within it, a few dried petals, a feather, a tiny vial of oil. Not for sale, just tokens. Outside, the wind picks up. You can hear it pushing against the shuttered windows. Elias does not look up. He's grinding again, slower now. The sound blending with the fire's low crackle, the creak of the wooden beams above. And the quiet, steady breath of a life lived in humble repetition. Not every day brings drama. Not every cure works, but the work continues. The drawers opened, the herb is chosen, the boiling water poured. This is what healing looked like. Quiet, careful, and full of unknowns. And now, in our final segment, we step forward in time. What was true and what was hopeful guesswork? What remedies have stood the test of science, and which were little more than ritual comfort? Take a final breath in the dusty warmth of the apothecary shop, and let's see what the evidence says. The candle in the apothecary shop has burned low. The shutters are closed now. The room has grown quiet. Let us step softly from the worn floorboards and wooden shelves of the past into the quieter, cleaner light of the present, where microscopes hum, white coats replace aprons, and formulas live not on parchment, but in vast databases and peer-reviewed journals. Even so, many of the ingredients, the roots, the leaves, the oils and resins remain with us, though now studied, quantified, cataloged in ways the apothecary of old could scarcely imagine. The question then is simple and gentle. What truly worked? What was simply ritual? What comfort endures? Let's begin, as so many remedies once did, with the bark of the willow tree. It was boiled into tea, ground into poultices, or soaked in warm water to ease aches of the joints, head, and back. Today, we know willow bark contains salicin, a natural chemical that, once inside the body, converts into a cousin of modern aspirin. Its bitterness, once merely tolerated, now tells us something of chemical structure, of anti-inflammatory effect, of pain gently soothed from within. Then there is valerian root, knotted, earthy, and often wrapped in linen to mask its scent. Given at dusk, steeped in warm water, it was said to calm the restless, quiet the churning mind, and welcome sleep. Now, in clinical studies, valerian has shown potential for influencing GABA receptors in the brain, the same system targeted by tranquilizers and sleep aids. The root's effects are modest, yes, but meaningful. Sleep may still arrive on wings of valerian, gently, if slowly. Feverfew, plucked fresh and dried in bundles, was long used to ease hot heads, fevers, and sudden pain in the temples. Though dismissed for centuries as folk nonsense, recent studies suggest that parthenoid, one of its active compounds, may indeed reduce the frequency and intensity of migraines. Not a cure, but a help. A small thread of ancient wisdom, woven now into clinical fabric, weavely too still present in modern medicine, used in syrups for cough, for hoarseness, and for inflammation of the throat. Contains glycyrrhizin, an anti-inflammatory compound, though we now understand its limits. In high doses or prolonged use, it can raise blood pressure and strain the heart. The apothecaries did not know the molecular cause, but they often warned not to take too much. And so, we see again, careful observation, waiting centuries for scientific explanation. Even garlic, once used to ward off both infection and misfortune, reveals itself to be more than superstition. It contains allicin, a sulfur compound released when garlic is crushed, which displays antibacterial and antifungal properties, strong enough for severe illness, but supportive. The clove, crushed into warm broth, still holds quiet promise. These are the successes, the remedies that weathered centuries, emerging not unchanged, but validated in part, tested, refined, and sometimes reborn. And yet, many others, when brought into the lab, dissolved like mist. Mandrake, with its eerie reputation and twisting roots shaped like human limbs, contains powerful alkaloids, dangerous, deliriant, and toxic. Its effects are real, but far from safe. Used in small amounts, it might numb pain, but its margin of error was thin. Too much, and the user fell not into healing sleep, but into a state of hallucination, coma, or death. Its mythos survived longer than its medical use. Leeches and bloodletting, once routine to rebalance the body's humors, are now understood to have caused great harm in most cases, weakening the patient, risking infection, and delaying true recovery. While bloodletting has rare, specific uses today, such as in treating hemochromatosis, its widespread historical use was largely misguided. Yet it stemmed not from malice, but misunderstanding, from a sincere attempt to make sense of a body with a no-germ theory. No microscopes, no hormones or microbes or molecular charts. Many medieval remedies fall somewhere in the middle, neither harmful nor curative. They were symbolic, warm compresses, frequent oils, chants whispered over steaming bowls. These did not change the chemistry of the illness, but they offered comfort. They gave the sick a sense of being seen, tended, accompanied. That alone, we now understand, has measurable value. The placebo effect, long misunderstood, is not simply imagined. It reflects the power of expectation, belief, and attention. The body does not exist separately from the mind, and in quiet rooms like the apothecaries, that connection was honored long before it was proven. Today, researchers study ancient herbals, not out of quaintness, but curiosity. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, the National Institutes of Health, and universities around the world are re-examining old texts, soil samples, and dried residues to find what the old world knew, even dimly. Pharmaceutical companies now derive medicines from the very plants that once hung in bundles from soot-darkened beams. Digitalis from foxglove, used to regulate the heart. Morphine from the opium poppy for pain. Quinine from cinchona bark, once warding off malaria. The difference is measurement, purification, standardization, but the roots, quite literally, remain the same. And in homes around the world, the rituals continue. A warm mug of tea before bed, a sachet of lavender tucked beneath the pillow, a drop of peppermint oil rubbed on a weary temple. These acts are not backward. They are human. They remind us that healing is not always a battle. Sometimes it is a slow retreat into quiet, a gathering of warmth, restoration of rhythm. The medieval apothecary worked with what they had: leaves, bark, intuition, and time. Their cures were imperfect, yes, but their care, their willingness to listen, to try, to soothe, still echoes in how we treat illness today. And so, we do not mock them, we honor them, for they, too, were searching for understanding, for gentleness, for ways to make the body a little less burdened. Now, the night has grown quiet. The bottles are still. The fire has gone out, but the knowledge, the idea that something small, when prepared with care, might help another person feel a little better, remains. Let that thought guide us gently into sleep, and in a moment, we'll conclude our story with one last quiet reflection, a look back and a breath forward. And so, we come to the end of our journey. The door to the apothecary's shop is closed now. The shutters are drawn. The last ember in the hearth has dimmed to a soft orange glow, barely there. The tools have been cleaned. The herbs have been returned to their shelves. The silence is whole. Tonight, we've wandered through another time, a world of low light, of mortar and pestle, of bitter brews and careful hope. We've met those who practiced a quiet craft in an age of uncertainty, who, with a little more than leaves, bark, and belief, tried to bring balance to the ailing body. They did not always succeed. They did not always understand, but they were not foolish. They worked within the limits of their time. They noticed, they remembered, they tried, and in that effort, in the small, steady motion of healing, there is something enduring, something still recognizable in the way we reach for a cup of warm tea, in the soft rituals of rest, in the instinct to care for someone with our hands, not just our knowledge. The apothecary's world has passed, but its rhythm remains, in the slowing of breath, in the stillness before sleep, in the gentle weight of blankets and time. We live now in an age of answers, but the old questions still whisper. What soothes? What comforts? What helps? Even if just a little. And so, we honor the quiet figures, the Agnesis and Eliases, Kay, the unnamed herbalists and careful mixers whose work lived not in books, but in moments of relief. Their shops are gone. But perhaps, as you drift into sleep tonight. Their kindness lingers still. Thank you for joining me on this slow journey through time. Okay? If you found comfort in tonight's story, please consider subscribing to our channel for more gentle explorations like this one. Okay? And if you're still awake, feel free to leave a comment letting me know any stories you'd like to hear. Now, close your eyes, let the world grow distant, and let the quiet settle all around you. Good night, and sleep well.